and why
We,
it's
we
gone on.
use that we use that term, don't we? Israel lobby. It's a bit of a shorthand.
Yeah.
But who are we referring to? And can we sort of just be a bit more specific about what that term means?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is difficult. Two famous American academics wrote a very long book trying to define what it is. So it's not an easy thing to define. The Israel lobby, I think, well, one can find components in it. Obviously, at the heart of it, there are elements of the Israeli state which are trying to mobilize supporters around the world. And you have uh, Jewish leadership, well, I tend to call them Jewish leadership organizations, but you have these institutions and in many different formats. In the UK, for instance, I would think of the Israel lobby as being obviously groups like the Board of Deputies. You have these more focused groups. I mean, in a sense, the Board of Deputies is some kind of umbrella organization claiming to represent British Jews and speak for them, while it's also speaking for Israel, and not have any particular problem with that blurred voice it's speaking with. Then you have these more focused kinds of organizations which are trying to deal with specific issues. You have the Community Security Trust, you have Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, and so on. Then you have movements within political parties. So you have the Jewish labor movement, which are trying to control the discourse within political movements to stop it developing there. You've also got Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel, and so on. So they're doing their own lobby work inside organizations. You could argue that the lobby is now diffusing. I mean, I find it frightening to think that somebody like Ruth Smith, who was clearly an Israel lobbyist when she was working for Viacom and other of these Jewish organizations, is now the head of Index on Censorship. What does that mean? Here's somebody who's trying to silence people talking about Israel, who's now in charge of the main free speech organization. I mean, it's just terrifying, really, when one thinks about it. So the lobby, in that sense, is quite broad, and it can embrace all sorts of organizations, even something like the Index on Censorship. In America, you see it with organizations. There's a certain way in which the lobby tries to disguise itself, because it doesn't want to be too obviously that it's promoting Israeli interests. So you see an organization in America like the Anti-Defamation League, which sounds great. Who's in favor of defamation? I mean, you want there to be an Anti-Defamation League, but actually what is really there is to stop you defaming Israel or criticizing Israel, we could also call it. So there's a certain level of veiled lobbying, and then there's some explicit lobbying, and then there's some special interest groups which are doing. So it's quite amorphous and quite difficult to pin it down exactly. But you can chart the sort of broad strokes of it fairly easily. And I think one needs to keep an eye on the personnel, because people tend to move around between these groups. It's quite incestuous in that way. And so you can often spot, Ruth Smith being a good example, but somebody like Ella Rose, for instance, there she is working in the Israeli embassy, and suddenly she pops up in the Jewish labor movement. So you start to think, well, what's she really doing there? Is she there just promoting Jewish voices in the Labour Party, as the Jewish labor movement would often try and present itself, or is she actually promoting some other kind of agenda? So there are lots of things going on here. I think that Israel obviously doesn't direct these things explicitly, but it's kind of there like a conductor in an orchestra. So it's trying to make sure everybody's on the same page, working in roughly the same direction. It's got these think tanks that are trying to work out how best to silence critics and so on, and it will then disseminate that information to useful groups who are doing that kind of work, and then they can work from a more informed environment. So that's probably my best way of trying to explain what it is.